One man, a broken soldier, walking through the snow with no destination, just pain. One dog, a retired K9, loyal beyond reason, suddenly barking into the storm like something had called him. And then, her, a little girl in a tattered red coat, barefoot, crying. Her arms wrapped tight around a teddy bear like it was the last thing that loved her. She looked up and whispered, "Is he the one? The one Daddy said would come back?" They were forgotten by everyone, except fate. If you had heard her voice in the snow, would you walk past? Or would you kneel down and say, "I'm here, you're safe now. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you watching from tonight?" Drop your city or country in the comments, because sometimes, even across miles of snow and silence, we find each other. Briar Glen, northern Cresmont. Winter lingered like a forgotten wound, and the snow fell quietly, thick, endless, muffling everything except what refused to be silenced. Jack Ryland sat hunched in his old armchair, shoulders stiff beneath a faded army green sweatshirt, head resting against his fist as the storm outside whispered like a distant memory. He hadn't moved in over an hour. The small wood stove nearby hissed and crackled, casting shifting light across the rustic walls of the cabin, but even its warmth couldn't reach the frost in Jack's bones. His breath was shallow, barely audible. His left leg twitched, phantom pain from a wound long since healed. His mind wasn't here. It rarely was. At 45, Jack looked older than he should. Years in combat had sculpted his frame into something lean and hardened, but grief had hollowed him out. His square jaw was shadowed with graying stubble, and deep creases had formed beneath his steel blue eyes. Eyes that once scanned deserts for threats now stared past walls into invisible things. PTSD had rewired him. Nights were worst. He couldn't sleep, yet he feared closing his eyes. That was when the crash returned, when the ice on the road claimed his wife and daughter and left him only with silence and a dog who refused to leave his side. Until now. He blinked. The cabin was quiet, too quiet. He shifted, scanning the floor, the doorway, the shadowed corners. "Ranger," he called. Nothing. He stood slowly, knees cracking from stillness, and stepped toward the door. It hung slightly ajar. A gust of icy air swept in as he opened it fully. Fresh snow had coated the porch, but what caught his eye were the paw prints leading out into the night. They were sharp, fresh. Ranger was gone. He didn't bolt or panic. Jack just stood there for a moment, one hand braced against the doorframe, listening. His gut clenched, not from fear, but something deeper. Recognition. Ranger wasn't just a dog. He was trained, disciplined, almost unnervingly perceptive. A 5-year-old German shepherd with a muscular frame, black and tan coat, and eyes that understood more than they should. Jack had rescued him after the unit retired him early. Too reactive, they said. Too protective. But tonight, Ranger had left on his own. Jack grabbed his coat and flashlight and stepped into the snow without thinking. The cold hit him like a slap. Snow fell in thick sheets, each flake reflecting his beam like shattered glass. He followed the tracks, each step punching into powder up to his shins. No other sound existed but wind and the crunch beneath his boots. He muttered aloud as he moved. "What did you see, boy?" Briar Glen slept behind him. The streets were blanketed, cars buried in white, lamplight flickering through fogged windows. The world looked untouched, but Jack knew better. Nothing stayed untouched. 10 minutes passed, then 15. He was about to call again when he heard it. A bark. Sharp. Urgent. Not far. Jack turned a corner and stopped. There, near the intersection of Ridgeway and Hollow Lane, beneath a crooked streetlight, stood Ranger. The dog's body was taut, tail still, ears forward, standing guard over something. No. Someone. Jack moved closer, the beam of his flashlight revealing a sight that clutched at his chest. A little girl. She couldn't have been more than 5. She sat slumped against the base of a frozen bench. Tiny arms wrapped tightly around a stuffed teddy bear, its fur gray and soaked with slush. Her red coat was torn and far too thin for the cold, her bare feet pink and trembling in the snow. Blonde hair stuck in messy tangles across her cheeks, and her face. God. Her face was streaked with dirt, her lips cracked and bleeding, her eyes glassy and wide. She wasn't crying. She was past crying. Ranger shifted as Jack approached, but didn't move away. He watched his handler with the same silent urgency he had in combat zones, as if saying, "This one matters." Jack knelt slowly, letting his flashlight fall to his side, face softening despite the sting of cold wind. He didn't reach for the girl. He simply spoke. "Hey there, I'm Jack. You're safe now. That's my dog. His name's Ranger. He's a good boy." The girl blinked. Then, in a voice so faint he thought he imagined it, she whispered, "Don't take him. Daddy said he'd come back." Jack felt the words settle in his chest like snow on stone. He didn't ask questions, not yet. Instead, he took off his coat and gently wrapped it around her small shoulders. She didn't resist, but she didn't let go of the bear either. Her hands were stiff, blue at the fingertips. "We're going home," he said softly. Ranger stepped closer, brushing against Jack's side as if to steady him. The three of them stood there for a moment under the broken light, a triangle of stillness in the middle of the storm. Then Jack lifted the girl into his arms. She weighed almost nothing. And Ranger, always walking slightly ahead, always listening, began leading them back through the snow, one silent step at a time. The snow had only grown heavier by the time Jack reached his cabin, the path now nearly invisible beneath a new white sheet. His breath came out in low clouds as he carried the little girl in his arms, Ranger trailing close at his side. Callie hadn't said another word since the moment she whispered in the street. Her head leaned against his shoulder, one tiny hand still clenched tightly around the damp teddy bear, the other twisted into the fabric of Jack's coat. She had not looked at his face once. She hadn't needed to. Her eyes stayed fixed on the dog. Inside the cabin, Jack kicked the door shut with his boot and knelt down near the stove, adjusting the fire with one hand while cradling the girl with the other. He reached for a thick wool blanket from the shelf and wrapped it around her, still warm from the fire's earlier burn. The cabin was modest, a small living space with aged wooden walls, a narrow bed in the corner, and an old table cluttered with folded maps, dog gear, and scattered empty coffee mugs. Jack set her gently on a folded quilt near the hearth. She didn't flinch. She didn't speak. She simply curled into herself like a child hiding from a world that never bothered to knock. Ranger sat down beside her and pressed his body lightly against hers. That finally made her move. She slid her arms around the dog's neck and buried her face in his fur. Jack watched in silence, his mouth opening as if to speak, then closing again. Instead, he grabbed an extra log for the fire and fed the flames. It wasn't until he poured a mug of warm water and set it near her that the girl finally spoke again, barely more than a whisper. "Callie," she said. Jack blinked. "Is that your name?" She nodded once, face still buried in fur. "Okay, Callie." He sat across from her on the floor, legs stretched out slowly to ease the stiffness in his joints. "I'm Jack. This is my place. No one can bother us here." Callie didn't answer, but she shifted just slightly, enough that her shoulder brushed Ranger's. The dog didn't move. His eyes stayed fixed on Jack, like a silent bridge between the two. Jack rubbed his temples. He hadn't spoken to a child in years, not since his own daughter, Clara. She had been the same age, 5, when the car slid off the frozen road. His wife, Mara, had been driving. Jack had been thousands of miles away, deep in a desert somewhere, holding a rifle and reading the news on a cracked tablet. He hadn't made it home in time. That guilt had lived inside him ever since. Maybe that's why this moment felt like a reckoning. He stood and moved to the corner table, grabbing the old landline phone, dialed the number for the local sheriff's office. A woman answered, her voice tired, probably near the end of her shift. "Briar Glen Sheriff's Department. This is Linda." "Hey, Linda, it's Jack Ryland. I found a kid." There was silence on the other end. "A kid?" "Yeah, about 5, alone on Ridgeway. Torn coat, no shoes. She said her name's Callie. She was freezing. My dog led me to her." "Jesus," Linda muttered. "Jack, we've got half the road shut down. Sheriff Weller and the search team won't be able to reach you tonight. You've got power?" "Yeah, fire's going." "All right, you keep her safe. I'll notify social services. We'll send someone as soon as the weather clears." Jack hung up and returned to the girl. She hadn't moved. "You'll stay here tonight," he said, more to the dog than to her. "Tomorrow, we'll get help. Real help." He laid out a bowl of water for Ranger and offered Callie a slice of bread and some apple slices. She stared at the food, then slowly, hesitantly, took one piece of apple and chewed it without looking up. Jack sighed in relief. Night deepened. Jack dimmed the kerosene lamp and wrapped himself in a blanket near the fire. He didn't sleep. He watched. Callie eventually leaned her head against Ranger and drifted off. In her sleep, she murmured, words he couldn't quite hear, but her fingers twitched and her brow furrowed. When morning came, pale light filtered through the frosted windows. Jack got up stiffly and moved to boil water. He turned back to the girl and stopped. Callie was awake. She sat cross-legged on the floor, a dull pencil in one hand, drawing on the back of an old envelope. The teddy bear was beside her, damp but still clutched. Ranger lay at her feet, one ear flicking. Jack approached slowly, crouching nearby. "You like to draw?" Callie nodded, but didn't speak. Jack tilted his head. "Can I see?" She hesitated, then handed him the page. The drawing was rough, childlike, but deeply unsettling. It showed a small house surrounded by trees. In front of the house stood a man, but his face was just a blank circle. Above him were jagged letters. "Don't talk unless Scout lets you." Jack felt a chill crawl up his spine. "Scout?" he asked. She pointed at Ranger. "That's him." Jack frowned. "That's Ranger." She shook her head. "He's Scout. Daddy said he'd protect me. Only talk if Scout lets you." Jack swallowed hard. He didn't know what this meant yet, but he knew that whoever her father was, he'd taught her to trust only one thing, and it had 4 legs and a beating heart. That afternoon the snow lightened, but the roads remained closed. Jack gave Callie a set of his daughter's old clothes, folded and kept in a chest he never opened until now. She changed behind a curtain, emerging in leggings and an oversized sweatshirt. Her face was cleaner, though her eyes still carried shadows far too old for 5. She didn't speak again for hours. But when Jack placed a cup of cocoa in front of her and sat across the table with his own, she looked up at him, for the first time fully, and asked, "Is he really your dog?" Jack smiled faintly. "He used to be theirs," he said, pointing to the army tag still hanging from Ranger's collar. "Now he's mine. But I think maybe he was always yours." Callie didn't smile, but she didn't look away either. The snow outside had calmed, leaving behind a world of sharp white edges and eerie quiet. Sunlight bounced off every surface with blinding intensity, making the forest surrounding Jack's cabin look almost pristine, untouched. But Jack Ryland knew better. The silence wasn't peace. It was a pause before something else. Inside the cabin, Callie sat at the table with a pencil and the back of another envelope. She was more alert today, her blonde hair now slightly combed, thanks to a brush Jack had found in an old drawer. She still hadn't spoken much, but she no longer shrank when he walked by. Ranger lay beneath her chair, resting his head on his paws, always watching the door. Jack stirred a pot of instant oatmeal at the stove, his back aching more than usual, though he didn't show it. He was starting to feel something unfamiliar again. Purpose. It scared him. Then came the knock. 3 taps, firm, no hesitation. Jack froze mid-motion. Ranger was already on his feet, ears perked, body tense. Callie's grip on her pencil tightened, and the color drained from her face. Jack moved to the door quietly and looked through the narrow window. A man stood on the porch, tall and composed. He wore a long charcoal gray wool coat zipped to the throat, tailored slacks, and polished black boots. His hands were tucked into leather gloves, and a black scarf covered half his face. He had a briefcase in one hand, the other now raised to knock again. He looked like he belonged to a conference room, not a snow-covered forest. Jack unlatched the door but didn't open it fully. He stood in the gap, body blocking the entrance. "Can I help you?" The man removed his scarf and offered a tight-lipped smile. He had pale skin, sharp cheekbones, and gray eyes that blinked too little. His dark hair was slicked back, and there wasn't a single wrinkle on his coat. He looked to be in his early 40s, but there was something ageless in his stare, like someone who'd practiced pretending for a very long time. "Good morning," he said smoothly. "I'm looking for a child, Callie Norwood. I was told she may have been found near here. I'm her uncle, James Holloway." Jack said nothing. Holloway continued, reaching into his coat and pulling out a card. "I work with the Montana Child Outreach Service. Her case is sensitive. I'm sure you understand." Jack took the card but didn't look down. You got ID? Holloway's smile tightened. Unfortunately, I rushed here on short notice. Roads were rough, and I didn't bring my credentials. But I assure you, Sheriff Weller knows who I am. Perhaps you could call him? Behind Jack, a growl began low in Ranger's chest. The dog stepped beside his handler, shoulders square, teeth slightly bared. It wasn't a warning. It was a promise. Callie appeared behind Ranger, her small face pale, her voice cracking. That's him, she whispered. That's the man who took Mommy. Time froze. Jack's hand dropped toward the bat leaning against the wall. His voice was flat steel. You need to leave. Holloway raised his hands slowly. Mr. Ryland, I understand your concern, but you're interfering with illegal custody retrieval. You're lying, Jack said, cutting him off. And this dog here doesn't growl unless he smells something real wrong. Holloway's face twitched, just for a second. Then he nodded slightly, reached into his coat again, and slipped a second business card into the doorframe. I understand. But know this. If you obstruct an investigation involving a missing child, there will be consequences. Jack slammed the door. Callie began to shake. Jack knelt beside her, wrapping one arm around her shoulder as Ranger positioned himself between them and the door. It's okay, Jack whispered. He's gone. He's not getting through us. Callie looked up at him, eyes filled with something older than fear. He had a badge. Mommy told me not to go. She said wait for Scout. Then she screamed, and he put her in a car. She didn't come back. Jack's jaw tightened. He didn't ask more. Instead, he picked up the card the man had left. The paper was thick, glossy, official-looking. But the agency name, Montana Child Outreach Service, wasn't one he recognized. He pulled out his dusty laptop, started it up slowly, and connected to his backup satellite hotspot. It was weak, but enough. A quick search revealed nothing. No website, no contact registry. No such agency existed. He picked up the cabin phone and dialed. This time, the call went straight to Nora Emmys, a woman he hadn't spoken to in over 2 years. Nora had been a field agent with the FBI when Mara, Jack's wife, was still alive. They had worked on the same multi-state trafficking task force. She was sharp, with a memory like a blade and a voice that could command a room. Tall and lean, with olive-toned skin and streaks of silver in her long black braid, Nora had been someone Mara trusted. Carson, she answered after 2 rings, voice brisk. Jack didn't waste time. Man showed up claiming to be a child welfare rep. Said his name's James Holloway. Callie identified him as the man who abducted her mother. Gave me a card, Montana Child Outreach Service. Can you run it? He heard typing. Give me 5, stay inside, don't let anyone else in. 5 minutes later, the phone rang. It's fake, Nora said. The agency doesn't exist. James Holloway is an alias tied to a man named Caleb Dorn, former intelligence contractor. Disappeared off the grid 4 years ago. Last known activity linked to child abduction for illicit placement schemes. No convictions. Very careful. Jack's voice dropped. Callie said he took her mother. Then we're dealing with more than just trafficking, Nora said. Watch your 6, Jack. He doesn't work alone. Jack hung up. Outside, the wind had picked up again, throwing loose snow into spirals. He stood at the window, arms crossed, watching the woods with narrowed eyes. In the corner, Callie had returned to her drawings. She was scribbling with more force now, like every stroke of her pencil was trying to erase something dark. Ranger lay at her feet, his eyes locked on the door. Whatever was coming next, Jack wasn't going to let it happen quietly. The sun had barely climbed above the tree line when Ranger began to pace. Jack noticed it first in the subtle ways, the flick of an ear, the low rumble in his throat when a gust of wind passed too quickly through the trees. The dog was restless, like something in the air had changed. Callie, now dressed in Jack's daughter's old clothes, sat silently at the table, drawing again. Her face had color now, but her eyes remained distant, as if part of her was still lost in that night outside the bench. Jack zipped up his coat and glanced at Ranger. You smell something? Ranger gave a sharp huff, his tail stiff, and moved to the door. Jack grabbed his rifle, not out of paranoia, but habit, and turned to Callie. We're going out for a bit. Just me and Ranger. You'll be okay here? She looked up, not with fear, but with a calm that didn't belong to a child. She nodded and whispered, He'll find them. That was all the confirmation Jack needed. The snow had hardened underfoot, crunching with every step as Ranger led the way through the woods behind the cabin. They moved silently, the air brittle and thin. Jack's breath came out in bursts, clouding around his scarred face. His eyes scanned the tree line, but he trusted Ranger more than his own senses. The dog moved with purpose, stopping only to sniff, circle, then surge ahead. Nearly an hour passed before they saw it. Nestled between a cluster of frozen birches, a small cabin, weather-worn and nearly swallowed by time, stood leaning to one side. The roof sagged under a heavy load of snow, and the walls were grayed from seasons of storm. Jack approached slowly, rifle down, but ready, eyes narrowing at the faint footprints leading around the side. Ranger growled low. Jack pushed open the door. Inside, the air was musty with mildew and old rot. A single iron cot sat in the corner, rusting at the joints, the blanket on it half burned. In the center of the room was a steel cabinet, its doors slightly ajar. Jack moved toward it and pulled them open. Inside were folders, dozens of them, worn, smudged, some singed at the edges. Each had a child's name printed in sharp black ink. Photos were clipped to many, girls, boys, most no older than Callie. Jack's stomach dropped. Pinned to the back wall was a torn map, one corner burned away. A red circle had been drawn over a location simply labeled Site 12. Lines radiated out from it like a spider's web. No towns, no labels, just the mark. Ranger whined softly and walked to a dark stain on the floor near the fireplace. Jack followed and crouched. The wood was scratched, grooved as if someone had been shackled there. He looked up at Ranger, voice low. This wasn't just a hideout. Someone was kept here. Jack pulled out his old flip phone and took photos of the folders, the map, the stains. The signal here was useless, so he pocketed the phone and turned toward the door. Let's move. By late afternoon, the wind had picked up again, and the clouds had begun to roll in thick over Briar Glen. Jack reached the cabin and slammed the door shut behind him. Callie sat in the same spot, still drawing, Ranger now circling her, as if to check she hadn't been moved. Jack uploaded the photos from his phone to his encrypted laptop, encrypted it further, and sent them through a secure channel. Only one person still alive would understand. Marla Quinn. She called within the hour. Her voice was low and clipped, as always. Jack, you're not dead yet. That's a surprise? Good to hear you too, Marla. She had always been the sharp edge in any room, tall, with a slim, wiry build, sharp features, cropped dark auburn hair, and eyes like cold steel. Her skin was pale from years working indoors, her voice a strange mix of dry sarcasm and pure authority. She used to work with Jack's wife, Mara, during their years in the federal field offices. After Mara's death, they hadn't spoken. Not once, until now. You found Site 12, she said. I found a map, Jack replied. Don't know what it points to yet, but there were files, photos, names, kids. Marla exhaled. We suspected Dorn had more than one location. If that map's accurate, we might finally have something. I'll bring a field team. Stay put. I have Callie, Jack said. She recognized Dorn on sight. There was a long silence. She's the key, isn't she? Marla murmured. She called Ranger Scout, said her dad told her not to talk unless Scout let her. I think the dog was trained by her family, maybe military. The father's missing. The mother, we don't know. You think she was planted with someone else? No, Jack said. I think she escaped. I'll be there by morning. Jack hung up and leaned back, letting the weight of the day settle in. The fire crackled softly beside him. Callie walked over, silent, and held out her latest drawing. It was a square building, concrete walls, no windows. Smoke rose from the top. In front stood a stick figure with no face and a dog drawn in sharp lines. Ranger. Jack took the drawing, studied it, then looked at her. Was this where you were? She nodded. He looked back at the drawing. His voice dropped. We'll find them. Callie didn't smile, but for the first time, her hand reached out and rested lightly on his sleeve. The wind was rising again. It screamed low through the trees like something alive, curling around the eaves of the cabin and rattling loose icicles from the gutter. Inside, the fire snapped quietly, barely enough to warm the corners. Jack hadn't slept all night. He sat near the window with his rifle across his knees, eyes flicking between shadows outside. Ranger lay curled at Callie's feet, tail twitching in his sleep. Jack's instincts, burnt into his bones from years of war, were thrumming. Something was wrong. Then came the knock. A slow, deliberate thud. Not the uncertain knock of a neighbor, nor the heavy bang of law enforcement. Just casual, confident. Jack stood without a word, motioned to Callie to stay put, and moved to the door, his boots silent on the wooden floor. He didn't open it. Instead, he whispered, "Ranger." The dog was up in a flash, teeth bared, fur raised. A voice called through the door, smooth, almost amused. "Jack, we meet again." He knew that voice, the man from 2 days ago, the one in the clean coat. Except this time, he didn't come alone. Jack ducked away from the door and moved toward Callie. "Up, we're leaving." She didn't ask why. She knew. Through the front window, Jack glimpsed 2 figures flanking the man. One was broad-shouldered and bald, his heavy boots crunching in the snow. The other wore a long brown coat and had a narrow face, gaunt and twitching. Their movements were sharp, military, but off. Too eager. He grabbed Callie's coat, stuffed her drawings into his pack, and slung it over his shoulder. Then he popped the back door, only to be met with a flash of movement in the trees. Shots cracked out. Wood splintered around the doorframe as Jack dove to shield Callie. Ranger lunged out with a snarl, vanishing into the storm. "Run!" Jack barked. They didn't use the trails. Jack took them through the ravine behind the cabin, down a slope of rock slick with ice. He moved like muscle memory, years of battlefield training flooding back. His body screamed at him. He wasn't 20 anymore, but survival burned in him like an old flame. Behind them, Ranger howled. Jack turned once. Ranger had latched onto the arm of the narrow-faced man, dragging him down into the snow. The man screamed, flailing, but Ranger held firm. Then a gunshot. Ranger yelped and vanished into the trees. "Ranger!" Callie screamed. Jack grabbed her hand and pulled her forward. "He'll find us! Just keep moving!" They ran for over a mile, deeper into the woods, until the trees parted. And Jack saw it. A squat metal building, half buried in snow, rust streaking down its side like tears. A radio tower jutted above it, long since dead. An old relay post. Back when Jack was still a comms specialist in a recon unit, this place had been their fallback station, a dead zone where even satellites struggled to connect. No one had been here in years. He kicked in the warped door, shoved Callie inside, and barricaded it with a steel bar. The power was long gone, but the backup lantern still hung where he remembered. He struck one with a flint, and it lit with a hiss. The place smelled like dust, oil, and ghosts. Callie sat on an old bench, her breath shallow. "Is Ranger gone?" Jack crouched in front of her. "He's smart. He's trained. He'll come back." She stared at the flickering lantern light, then whispered, "They had badges." Jack frowned. "What kind of badges?" "Like police, but Mommy said they weren't. She tried to call for help, but the line went dead. Then they said she'd gone for a walk. She never came back." Her voice cracked at the end. Jack's jaw clenched. What did they want? "She told them no. They wanted to take me," she said, "over my dead body." And they made it happen. Jack sat back slowly. His thoughts churned like the snowstorm outside. Fake law enforcement, children vanishing, and a girl left in the cold with only a dog to protect her. He looked at Callie, at the resolve behind those tired eyes. "She never screamed," Callie said suddenly, "not even when they took her." Jack nodded slowly. "She was brave." "She was everything," Callie whispered. Jack rose and scanned the room. In one corner, beneath a tarp, was the old console. Dead now. But if the generator could be jump-started, it might ping a signal to someone still listening. He began to work. Stripping wire, connecting clamps, igniting the backup panel. The power sputtered once, then caught. A soft green light blinked to life. Jack keyed in the distress code he had memorized years ago, an old code, one meant for black site fallback. Then he waited. The wind screamed outside, but somewhere in it, Ranger howled back. Snow fell in thick, whispering sheets. veiling the world in white silence as the convoy of unmarked black SUVs rolled down the forest road toward Site 12. Marla Quinn sat in the passenger seat of the lead vehicle, eyes locked on the flickering green signal from Jack's old code still blinking on the laptop before her. A former field agent turned specialist in human trafficking investigations, Marla was in her early 40s, tall and lean with sharp cheekbones and deep-set hazel eyes that missed nothing. Her ash-brown hair was tied back in a practical bun, and she wore a heavy black parka over her tactical gear. There was no trace of softness in her voice or posture. Years of chasing ghosts had carved that away. Beside her, Special Agent Troy Beckman manned the comms. Beckman was younger, in his early 30s, with a tightly trimmed beard and thick build. He had the steady nerves of someone who had kicked down too many doors to be easily rattled. His gloved fingers moved swiftly over the laptop as they approached the site. "Thermal's not showing much," Beckman muttered. "Cold concrete, dead power lines, like they want us to think it's abandoned." Marla didn't respond. Her gaze lifted to the trees, scanning. They never thought anyone would come back. At the relay post, Jack watched from the shadows as the SUVs rolled up, tires crunching snow. He didn't wave, didn't call out. He waited until he saw her. Marla stepped out, snow clinging to her boots, and looked up at the tower. Jack emerged slowly, Callie held close in one arm. When Marla saw him, something softened beneath her eyes. "You still remember how to cause hell," she said dryly. Jack gave a small nod. "She's alive. Her name is Callie." Marla's eyes dropped to the girl, who blinked up at her with the wary caution of someone who had learned not to trust uniforms. Then, as if recognizing something in the woman's face, Callie whispered, "She smells like Mom." Marla blinked. "Lydia?" Jack nodded grimly. "We think she's inside Site 12, or she was." Ranger, limping but determined, emerged from the woods then, muzzle streaked with ice, tail wagging low. He pushed his head into Callie's hand, and she crumpled against him in relief. They didn't wait long. Site 12 looked like an outdated welfare counseling center, its sign half buried in snow, faded blue paint peeling from the front door. The building itself was square and windowless, lined with frost-slicked cinder block. But the smell, that faint chemical rot, told Jack and Marla all they needed. Inside, the rooms were staged. Plastic chairs, clipboards, cheap motivational posters about family unity. But no heat. No hum of machinery. No power. Ranger growled low in his throat. He sniffed once, twice, then bolted left, claws scrabbling against tile. The team followed. He led them past false walls and a locked fire door that Beckman blew open with a small charge. Beyond it, stairs descending into cold blackness. Jack went first, rifle ready, flashlight cutting through the dark. The air was different down there, damp, recycled, and then they heard it. A cough. Marla held up her fist. They moved as one. Down a narrow hall they found it. A hidden chamber, lined with rusted beds and bolted chairs. 3 adults were inside, 2 unconscious, 1 curled in the corner mumbling. And in the far corner, emaciated, eyes wide but blank, was a woman with tangled blonde hair and a hospital bracelet around her wrist. She didn't look up at first. Then Ranger whined, a soft, high sound, and the woman's gaze flicked toward him. "Scout?" she whispered. Jack froze. Marla stepped forward, removing her gloves. "Lydia," she said softly. "It's Marla. You're safe now." Lydia Ryland, once a trauma therapist, now sat wrapped in a hospital gown under layers of dust. She was 38, average height but fragile thin now, with blue eyes dulled by trauma and confusion. Her once golden hair hung in matted strands, and her hands trembled as she reached toward the dog. Ranger moved closer, pressing his head against her knee. Slowly Lydia blinked as if coming awake. "Where's my daughter?" she rasped. From behind Jack, a small voice cried out. "Mommy!" Callie broke free and ran to her, her boots slipping on the icy floor. Lydia fell forward, arms open, and they collapsed into each other with a gasp, mother and child entwined in tears and shaking limbs. Jack turned away, swallowing hard. Beckman moved in to secure the area, while medical responders poured down the stairwell. Lydia was weak, dehydrated, but otherwise unharmed. The doctor spoke of stress-induced memory loss. Temporary. reversible. Jack stood in the hallway as Marla joined him. "She was their leverage," Marla said. "The ones who refused to give up their kids. They got locked away." Jack's voice was a growl. "How many?" "We won't know until we map the whole network, but this place, this is just one node." They both looked back at the family reunion in the room. "She fought for her daughter," Jack said. "Even in pieces she came back for her." Marla nodded. "And so did you." The courthouse in Briar Glen was nothing like the grand stone palaces of major cities. It was modest, a 2-story brick building with a flagpole out front, and a clock that hadn't worked since the year Jack Ryland returned from his last tour. But that morning, as snow glistened on the courthouse steps and armed marshals flanked the entrance, the building might as well have been the stage of a nation's reckoning. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with low murmurs. Reporters, victims' families, federal investigators, and concerned citizens all squeezed into pews. At the front of the room stood the accused, Owen Locke, tall and lean in a pressed gray suit, his silver hair slicked back, jaw clenched with the kind of arrogant composure that once earned trust. He was 63, face angular and weathered with age, but his eyes still gleamed cold and calculating. He had once been the director of a regional welfare coordination office. His name carried power in nonprofit circles. Now, shackled at the wrists, he was just another man hiding behind a mask too long. Jack sat at the edge of the second row, his posture rigid. His face bore the shadow of fatigue, but his eyes burned sharp with focus. Beside him, Ranger rested at his feet, black and brown fur glossy, his ears twitching at every unfamiliar sound. On the bench just ahead, Lydia Ryland sat with her hand gently around her daughter's shoulder. Her blonde hair brushed and tied loosely, though the tremor in her fingers betrayed her nerves. Callie sat upright, a crimson ribbon in her hair, her small fingers clinging to the loop of Ranger's collar. "Case number 51283, the bailiff announced. People versus Owen Locke." The judge, Cassandra Wills, a stern woman in her 50s with short steel-gray curls and square glasses perched on the bridge of her nose, nodded for the prosecution to proceed. Her voice was no nonsense, but her eyes softened briefly when they settled on Callie. The first to testify was Jack. He rose and walked with a soldier's gait, straight-backed despite the pain in his knees. On the stand, his voice was firm, not loud, not shaky, just measured, every word deliberate. He recounted how he had found Callie in the snow, how Ranger had led him to Site 12, and the evidence they uncovered there. His tone remained controlled until he described the underground chambers, the locked doors, the silent victims, the smell. Then, just briefly, his voice caught. He turned to look at Owen. "He hid behind official seals and printed promises," Jack said. "He turned state funding into shackles. He lied in ink, but bled people dry in silence." There was no rebuttal from the defense, only a tired lawyer flipping pages with no answers. Then came the moment everyone had waited for. "Callie Ryland, will you approach the bench?" The room held its breath. Lydia gave her daughter a soft nudge, and Ranger stood up with her. The dog walked slowly beside the 5-year-old, step for step, like a shadow. Callie wore a navy blue dress and thick tights. Her small boots clicked against the floor as she stepped up to the raised seat. She climbed into it carefully and sat upright, eyes peeking over the edge of the witness box. Ranger sat at her feet, facing outward. The prosecutor, a kind-eyed woman named Ellen Graves, crouched beside the box, lowering her voice. "Callie, do you remember the man who took your mommy away?" Callie nodded. "Is he in this room?" Callie raised one finger and pointed at Owen Locke. "That's him," she said. "He told mommy she was unfit." But then he heard her. He took her down the stairs and locked the door. "And did he ever say anything to you?" Callie hesitated, eyes flicking to Ranger. He said if I screamed, he'd take Scout too. But Ranger, he's not scared of monsters." The courtroom was silent except for the shuffling of paper and the quiet sobs from a woman in the back row, one of many who had once questioned themselves for not speaking up. Owen shifted uncomfortably. The defense attorney objected half-heartedly, but Judge Wills waved it off. "She is a protected witness. Let her speak." Callie went on to describe the symbols she remembered on the walls of Site 12, the locked doors, and the sound of other children crying at night. Ellen Graves pulled out the drawings Callie had made at Jack's cabin, crude crayon sketches of stick-figure men with no faces, badges shaped like twisted stars, and a scribbled map that perfectly aligned with the floor plan of Site 12. With each piece of evidence, the weight on Owen Locke's shoulders grew heavier. And then Lydia was called. Her voice trembled more than Jack's, but her words were clear. She detailed her capture, her forced sedation, the psychological abuse. But what silenced the room most was when she said, "They called it intervention, but it was incarceration. And my only crime was asking why a man with no credentials had access to my child's records." The trial lasted hours, but the verdict didn't take long. That evening, under heavy snow and dimming light, Judge Wills read the sentence. Owen Locke, for conspiracy, child endangerment, unlawful detainment, and fraud. You are hereby sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The courthouse exhaled as one. Outside, the press surged. Cameras flashed. Voices shouted. But Jack, Callie, Lydia, and Ranger quietly exited through the back door. They didn't need the cameras. They had each other. By late March, the snow that had once blanketed Briar Glen in silence had begun to retreat, giving way to the first shy blades of green and a sky no longer weighed down by gray. Spring didn't arrive with ceremony. It crept in on the heels of thawing mornings and sun that lingered just a little longer each afternoon. Birds returned in hesitant flocks, their songs weaving through the town's slow return to warmth and motion. At the end of Ashbury Lane, nestled behind a white picket fence and 2 birch trees not yet in bloom, stood a modest 2-story farmhouse. The paint was fresh, but the porch still creaked, and the garden beds bore signs of new life not yet awakened. A small brass plaque beside the front steps read, Eliza House, Est, 2025. It had taken Jack Ryland nearly 45 years and 1 dog to find home. He stood now by the fence, in jeans and a faded flannel, the sleeves rolled to reveal forearms marked by time and quiet wars. His salt and pepper hair was longer than it used to be. Lydia said it softened him, and his once permanent frown had been replaced by something closer to wonder, though his eyes still carried that watchful glint. The sun hit his face as he watched a small girl chase Bubbles across the lawn. Callie, now 5.5, wore a denim jacket covered in colorful patches Lydia had stitched for her. Little stars, a stitched version of Ranger's head, and a pink heart on the elbow. Her hair had grown longer, brushing her shoulders, and her laughter was no longer a sound Jack feared would vanish too quickly. Behind her, lying with one paw draped lazily over the wooden porch step, was Ranger, now almost 6. His black and brown coat was thick and glossy, his ears twitching at every bird call, but his eyes half closed, calm. A red tag clinked gently on his collar, engraved with silver letters, Guardian of Eliza. Inside the house, Lydia Ryland moved between the kitchen and living room, humming softly. Her hair had regained its luster, golden and tied back with a patterned scarf. The haunted look that once clouded her hazel eyes had faded, replaced by the focused calm of someone who had wrestled back control of her story. She had returned to nursing part-time at the town clinic, but her favorite hours were spent by the fireplace, sketching new ideas for the trauma recovery center she hoped to help build in the summer. The house itself had been gifted by an anonymous funder. The kind of silent hero stories like theirs seemed to attract. Jack, of course, suspected Marla Quinn had something to do with it. The FBI agent still checked in from time to time, though her role in the town had shifted from law enforcement to legend. Her photo still sat on the shelf beside Callie's hand-drawn picture of Ranger stopping the bad guys. The living room was a blend of lives now fused into one. On the mantel hung a single photograph in a rustic wooden frame. It showed Jack, Lydia, and Callie standing beneath the birch trees in midwinter, Ranger seated proudly in front of them. The light caught in their eyes as if the sun had been waiting for that exact moment to return. Beneath the photo, written in careful cursive, "We didn't find each other, Ranger did." Jack still had his battles. The nights were quieter, but not always still. Sometimes he would sit alone by the back door, staring into the dark with a steaming cup of black coffee in hand, the porch light throwing long shadows across the yard. Ranger would be beside him, just as he'd always been, ready to nudge Jack's hand when the quiet stretched too far. But those nights were fewer now. One evening, as the sky blushed lavender and the wind carried the scent of thawed pine, Callie climbed up onto the porch swing beside Jack. She carried a new stuffed bear, this one handmade by Lydia, and placed it on her lap. "Daddy Jack," she said softly, using the title she had chosen herself. "Do you think other kids are still lost?" Jack looked at her, the lines around his eyes deepening. "Maybe," he said. "But I think they'll find someone, like we did." "Because of Ranger?" He smiled, nodding. "Because of Ranger." A silence fell between them, but it wasn't empty. From inside, Lydia's voice called, "Dinner!" Jack stood, stretched slowly, then offered his hand. Callie took it without hesitation, hopping off the swing. Ranger stood too, shaking out his fur with a huff and following them up the steps. He paused only briefly, nose tilted to the wind, ears perked. Somewhere out there, the world still spun with cold and cruelty. But for now, here on this patch of porch, there was warmth. There was peace. There was a family, and a dog who had never once failed to listen when fate whispered. Some stories begin with silence, but this one began with a bark. Callie was just a child in a torn red dress, shivering on a frozen street, holding on to hope the world had forgotten. But God hadn't. Neither had Ranger. Maybe it was fate. Maybe it was faith. Or maybe, just maybe, God sent a shepherd not with a crook, but with paws and a bark to guard his lost lambs. In a world that often feels cold and cruel, this story is a reminder. Miracles don't always come with trumpets. Sometimes they come wrapped in fur and walk beside a broken man who never stopped listening. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who still believes that goodness walks among us. Leave a prayer in the comments for all the children still waiting to be found. And don't forget to subscribe for more true stories of hope, redemption, and the love that only heaven could have written. May God bless you and keep you warm tonight.